the early hours of September 1st, 1939, the world changed forever. At dawn, the sky above Poland filled with the sound of roaring engines, the thunder of artillery, and the scream of bombs falling from the clouds. It was the beginning of the most devastating conflict in human history. The invasion of Poland marked not just the start of World War II, but the death of an old world and the birth of a new, darker era. For months, Europe had watched Adolf Hitler with unease. His rise to power, his defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, his annexation of Austria and the Sudetenlandal had been met with hesitation, fear, and diplomacy. Britain and France had drawn red lines before, and each time they were crossed, they did nothing. But Poland was supposed to be different. Poland was the line that could not be crossed, or so they believed. Behind closed doors, the fate of Poland had already been sealed. On August 23, 1939, in Moscow, two men shook hands: Joachim von Ribbentrop, Germany's foreign minister, and Vyacheslav Molotov, his Soviet counterpart. Together, they signed what would become one of the most shocking and cynical agreements in modern history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Secretly, it contained a chilling clause: the two powers would divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland, caught between two giants, was marked for destruction. To Hitler, the invasion was not just about territory, it was about revenge, ideology, and destiny. He saw Poland as the first step toward his vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. To achieve it, Poland had to be erased, its people subjugated, its culture dismantled. On the eve of invasion, Hitler told his generals, "Our enemies are small worms. I saw them at Munich." He was confident that Britain and France would once again hesitate. After all, why would they go to war for Poland when they hadn't for Czechoslovakia? At 4:45 a.m., near the small town of Wilu, German bombers appeared over the horizon. Without warning, they unleashed destruction upon the sleeping town. Hospitals, schools, and homes were obliterated. It was the first aerial bombing of the war, a deliberate attack on civilians meant to spread terror. Minutes later, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte near Danzig. The shells thundered across the bay, marking the first shots of World War II. In that moment, the world entered a nightmare from which it would not awaken for 6 long years. The Germans called it blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a new kind of warfare, fast, coordinated, and merciless. Tanks, planes, and infantry moved together in perfect synchronization, overwhelming the enemy before they could react. The Polish army, brave but outdated, found itself fighting an enemy unlike any it had faced before. Cavalry met tanks, rifles met machine guns, and the skies belonged entirely to the Luftwaffe. Yet, despite the odds, Poland did not surrender. From the first day, Polish soldiers fought with fierce determination. At Westerplatte, a garrison of just 180 men held off a German force of over 3,000 for 7 days. In the south, near Mokra, Polish cavalry units ambushed German tanks, destroying dozens before being forced to retreat. They knew they could not win, but they refused to go quietly. In Warsaw, panic spread as news of the invasion reached the capital. Sirens wailed, and families fled to basements and shelters. The Polish government appealed to Britain and France to honor their alliance and declare war on Germany. On September 3rd, they did. Britain and France were officially at war with Nazi Germany, but their armies did not move. The phony war, as it would later be called, had begun in the west, while Poland fought alone in the east. For the German army, victory seemed inevitable. But even as their forces advanced, Hitler's generals were uneasy. They feared Soviet intervention, or worse, that the Western Allies might strike before Germany had secured the East. But the Soviets were not yet enemies. They were waiting. 2 weeks later, on September 17th, their patience ended. Soviet troops crossed Poland's eastern border, claiming to protect Belarusians and Ukrainians. In reality, it was the second act of the same tragedy. Poland was now being crushed from both sides. There would be no escape. By the end of September, the Polish government fled to Romania. Warsaw fell after a brutal siege that left the city in ruins. Over 20,000 civilians were killed. German and Soviet soldiers met in the center of Poland, shaking hands in grim celebration. The country was divided exactly as the secret pact had decreed. For the Polish people, the nightmare was just beginning. Under German occupation, terror became a daily reality. The Nazis began executing intellectuals, teachers, and priests, anyone who could inspire resistance. Villages were burned, families torn apart, and Jews were forced into ghettos. In the Soviet zone, thousands were deported to Siberia, executed, or imprisoned. The invasion of Poland was not only the spark of World War II, it was the blueprint for the horrors that would follow. Blitzkrieg had proven its power. The world had seen how fast democracy could fall, how easily treaties could be broken, and how silent the world could be in the face of aggression. But beneath the rubble of Warsaw and the ashes of Polish towns, something unbroken remained: the will to resist. Across Europe, people watched in fear and disbelief. Some refused to believe the scale of what was happening. Others whispered that this was only the beginning. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated. He had achieved a swift victory, and his gamble had paid off. But what he could not yet see was that this success would sow the seeds of his eventual downfall. Poland's fall had awakened sleeping giants: Britain, France, and eventually the United States. The world would never again stand idly by. The road to global war had begun, and there was no turning back. When the smoke cleared over Warsaw, Poland was gone from the map, but not from history. The guns had fallen silent, yet what followed was not peace, it was a systematic dismantling of a nation. The German occupation began with cold precision. Entire cities were catalogued, renamed, and stripped of their identity. Hitler's plan for Poland was simple: erase it. He called it the Generalplanost, a vision of a new Europe where the Slavs were reduced to servants, the Jews eliminated, and German settlers would take their place. The first phase of this plan began immediately. Universities were shut down. Libraries were burned. The Polish language was banned in schools. Teachers, priests, and community leaders were rounded up and executed. It was called the Intelligence Action, the extermination of the Polish intelligence. By destroying the minds of Poland, the Nazis hoped to destroy its spirit, but the spirit refused to die. Even as German troops marched through Polish streets, underground movements began to form. Former soldiers, students, and ordinary citizens built secret networks of resistance. They printed newspapers, smuggled weapons, and sent reports to the Polish government in exile. Beneath the occupation, an invisible war had begun. Meanwhile, in the Soviet-controlled East, another kind of terror unfolded. The Red Army arrived proclaiming liberation, but for the Polish people, it was another form of enslavement. Thousands of Polish officers were arrested and sent to camps deep within the Soviet Union. Families were deported to Siberia, stripped of their homes and possessions. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, carried out one of the most infamous crimes of the war: the Katyn massacre. Over 20,000 Polish officers, doctors, and intellectuals were executed with a single bullet to the back of the head, their bodies buried in mass graves. For decades, Moscow denied responsibility, blaming the Nazis, but the truth could not be buried forever. The Katyn massacre symbolized the cruel reality of Poland's position, caught between two totalitarian empires that saw it as nothing more than a pawn. Back in occupied Poland, daily life became a test of endurance. Curfews, forced labor, food shortage, every aspect of existence was controlled. Jews were segregated into ghettos, the largest being in Warsaw. Surrounded by walls and barbed wire, hundreds of thousands were trapped inside, starved and dehumanized. Disease spread quickly, but so did hope. Secret schools operated in basements, teaching children forbidden subjects. Smugglers risked their lives to bring in bread and medicine. In those dark alleys, humanity still flickered. The ghettos were not just prisons, they were symbols of defiance. The Polish resistance, known as the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, became one of the largest underground forces in Europe. They gathered intelligence, sabotaged railways, and executed collaborators. Their reports on German troop movements proved vital to the Allies. One of their greatest achievements came in 1943, when Polish spies smuggled information about the extermination camps to the west. They revealed the existence of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, places where millions would perish. But when the reports reached London and Washington, many refused to believe them. The truth was too horrifying to accept. For the Nazis, Poland became the laboratory of genocide. It was here that they tested the methods that would later be used across Europe. The first concentration camps were built on Polish soil: Auschwitz, Majdanek. At first, they were prisons for political enemies, but soon they became factories of death. Trains arrived daily, packed with Jews, Poles, and other undesirables. Few ever returned. In the words of one survivor, the sky above Auschwitz was always grey not because of the weather, but because of the smoke. Yet, even in the shadow of death, resistance endured. In 1942, inside the Warsaw Ghetto, a group of young fighters formed the Jewish Combat Organization. They knew they could not win, but they refused to die in silence. When the Germans came to liquidate the ghetto in April 1943, the uprising began. For nearly a month, the fighters held out against tanks and flamethrowers, armed with little more than pistols and homemade bombs. The world watched in silence, but their courage echoed far beyond the walls of Warsaw. It was the first large-scale urban rebellion against Nazi ruler, a cry of defiance that proved the human spirit could not be crushed. Outside Poland, the invasion had set in motion a chain of events that reshaped the world. Britain and France had declared war, but their response was sluggish. The Western Front remained eerily quiet, while the East burned. Hitler used the time to prepare his next moves. In April 1940, he invaded Denmark and Norway. In May, he struck West Belgium, the Netherlands, and France fell in a matter of weeks. Europe was collapsing under the weight of blitzkrieg. Poland had been the beginning, a rehearsal for the storm that now engulfed the continent. In exile, the Polish government regrouped in London, determined to continue the fight. Thousands of Polish pilots, sailors, and soldiers escaped through Hungary, Romania, and France to join the Allies. When Britain stood alone against Germany in 1940, Polish pilots played a crucial role in the Battle of Britain. Flying outdated aircraft, they achieved some of the highest kill ratios of the entire campaign. Their courage became legendary, and their motto echoed across the skies, "For your freedom and ours." Meanwhile, in occupied Poland, the resistance continued to grow. Secret radio stations broadcast messages of hope. Underground courts sentenced traitors. Children acted as couriers, slipping through checkpoints with coded messages. Every act of defiance carried the risk of death, but also the promise of dignity. Poland was bleeding, but it was not broken. The German occupation grew increasingly brutal as the war dragged on. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned to the ground. Entire communities were wiped out in reprisal. In the countryside, forests became sanctuaries for fighters. The Home Army waged a guerrilla war, striking from the shadows and disappearing into the night. In 1944, they launched Operation Tempest, a nationwide uprising timed to coincide with the Soviet advance. Their hope was to liberate Polish cities before the Red Army arrived, to reclaim their land on their own terms. But hope, once again, was betrayed. In July 1944, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The Home Army rose up, seizing control of much of the city. For 63 days, they fought street by street, room by room, against overwhelming odds. Civilians joined the battle, turning rubble into barricades and ruins into fortresses. They believed Soviet help was coming, but the Red Army stopped at the Vistula River and watched. Stalin refused to intervene. The uprising was crushed. Over 200,000 Poles were killed, and Warsaw was systematically destroyed. It was one of the most tragic chapters of the entire war. By the time the Red Army finally entered the city in January 1945, there was almost nothing left. The capital was a skeleton of ash and stone. For many Poles, liberation felt like another kind of occupation. The Nazis were gone, but the Soviets remained, bringing their own form of control. The dream of a free Poland would have to wait decades more to be realized. Still, the legacy of the invasion lived on. It had exposed the fragility of peace, the cruelty of ambition, and the price of freedom. It showed the world what happens when evil is appeased and promises are broken. But it also revealed the strength of a people who refused to disappear, even when the world abandoned them. The story of Poland in 1939 was not just a national tragedy, it was a warning, written in blood for generations to come. As September rolled on, the skies over Poland were filled with the hum of German aircraft. The relentless bombing of cities and towns continued, turning once peaceful streets into landscapes of fire and ruin. Warsaw, the capital, became a primary target. Civilians huddled in basements as bombs rained down, tearing through homes, hospitals, and schools. The Luftwaffe's power was overwhelming, a terrifying display of modern warfare unleashed on a population caught completely off guard. The Polish Air Force fought valiantly, but it was hopelessly outnumbered. Many Polish pilots took to the skies in outdated planes, facing wave after wave of German bombers and fighters. Despite impossible odds, they managed to bring down dozens of enemy aircraft, earning the respect of even their foes. On the ground, the German blitzkrieg continued with astonishing speed. Tanks rolled across open fields, cutting off Polish units from one another. Communication lines collapsed, railways were destroyed, and command centers were captured before orders could even be given. Soldiers who had fought bravely found themselves surrounded, unable to regroup. Villages were set ablaze, and refugees clogged the roads, desperate to escape the chaos. Amid this destruction, acts of incredible bravery emerged. In small towns and countryside roads, Polish soldiers made last stands against overwhelming German firepower. They fought with whatever weapons they had, often rifles and bayonets against tanks and machine guns. These moments, though ultimately futile, became symbols of defiance. One of the most remarkable stories came from the Battle of Wisna, often called the Polish Thermopylae. Outnumbered 40-1, a small group of Polish defenders held their position against the advancing German army for 3 days. Their courage delayed the German push just long enough for other forces to reposition, proving that even in defeat, resistance could still mean something. But while Poland was being torn apart from the west, an even darker twist was about to unfold from the east. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland under the terms of its secret agreement with Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed just weeks earlier, had included a hidden clause that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would take the western part of Poland, and the Soviet Union would take the east. When Soviet troops crossed the border, the already battered Polish forces realized their fate was sealed. There was no longer any possibility of holding the line. The Polish government, shocked and desperate, fled the country. In the cities of eastern Poland, Soviet propaganda claimed they were liberating the region's people from fascism. But the reality was brutal occupation. Polish officers were arrested, intellectuals were targeted, and thousands were deported to Siberia. The invasion from both sides crushed any remaining hope of organized resistance. Warsaw, still holding out under constant bombardment, became the final symbol of Poland's defiance. The city's defenders refused to surrender, even as supplies dwindled and fires consumed block after block. Civilians joined the effort, building barricades and carrying ammunition to the front lines. The city's hospitals overflowed, and food became scarce, but still the Polish flag flew above the ruins. General Walerian Chuma, commanding Warsaw's defense, knew the situation was hopeless, but refused to give an easy. German demands for surrender were ignored again and again. For nearly 3 weeks, the capital endured relentless shelling from artillery and bombers. Then, on September 25th, the Germans launched what they called Black Monday, the largest single air raid on Warsaw. Hundreds of bombers filled the sky, dropping incendiaries and explosives that turned the city into a firestorm. Entire districts were flattened. Yet even after that, Warsaw held on for a few more days. It wasn't until September 28th that the Polish commanders finally agreed to cease fire, realizing that further resistance would only lead to more civilian deaths. The fall of Warsaw marked the end of major organized resistance in Poland, but not the end of Polish courage. Across the countryside, small pockets of soldiers refused to surrender, retreating into forests and mountains to continue the fight as partisans. Many escaped through Romania and Hungary, determined to regroup abroad. These men would later form the foundation of the Polish armed forces in exile, fighting alongside the Allies in France, Britain, and later in the skies over Europe. As Poland fell, the world watched in shock. The speed and ferocity of Germany's campaign stunned military observers. The term blitzkrieg, lightning war, became known to the world. It represented a new kind of warfare, fast, coordinated, and devastating. For Hitler, it was proof that his army was unstoppable. For the rest of Europe, it was a warning. Britain and France had declared war on Germany after the invasion began, but their actions were limited. While the Polish army was crushed under the weight of the German and Soviet onslaught, the Allies stayed behind their defensive lines in what would later be called the phony war. Poland had been promised support, but in the end, it was left to fight alone. The invasion revealed not only Germany's power, but also the weaknesses and hesitation of the Western powers. In just over a month, a nation of over 30 million people had been conquered and divided. Yet the Polish spirit endured. Underground networks began forming almost immediately. Secret newspapers were printed, coded messages were passed, and resistance cells took root even under the harshest occupation. Teachers taught in secret, soldiers planned in hiding. and ordinary people risked their lives to preserve their culture and identity. Meanwhile, the consequences of the invasion rippled far beyond Poland's borders. The Soviet Union began its own campaign of repression in the East, deporting entire families, executing officers, and silencing any opposition. One of the darkest chapters would come the following year, with the massacre of over 20,000 Polish officers and intellectuals in the Katyn Forest, a crime denied by the Soviets for decades. For Hitler, Poland was just the beginning. With the East secured, his eyes turned westward toward France and the rest of Europe. The world had entered a new era of total war. The invasion of Poland was not just the start of World War II, it was the unveiling of a terrifying new reality, a world where no treaty, no border, and no promise could stop the tide of destruction that was coming. As Poland lay defeated and divided, the consequences of its fall began to unfold across Europe. What had started as a regional invasion had now become a global shockwave. The world understood that this was not a limited conflict, it was the beginning of something far greater. Germany's rapid success emboldened Hitler, convincing him that the blitzkrieg was an unstoppable weapon. In Berlin, he was celebrated as a strategic genius, while propaganda films glorified the victory over Poland as proof of Germany's military superiority. The Nazi regime broadcast triumph across every radio frequency, parading captured Polish flags and boasting of the new order in Europe. But beneath the celebration was the grim machinery of occupation. In the German-controlled western half of Poland, life quickly turned into a nightmare. The Nazi plan for Poland was not simply to occupy it, but to erase it. Cities were renamed, Polish schools were shut down, and intellectuals, priests, and community leaders were rounded up and executed. The German secret police, the Gestapo, moved swiftly to crush any potential resistance. Thousands were sent to newly established concentration camps, the most infamous being Auschwitz, which at first held Polish political prisoners before becoming a site of unimaginable horror later in the war. The Nazi policy toward Poles was clear: to enslave, to Germanize, or to destroy. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Zone, the Soviet Union enforced its own brutal regime. Villages were stripped of resources, families were deported to Siberia, and political purges became routine. Soviet soldiers and secret police viewed anyone with education or authority as a potential threat. The NKVD executed thousands without trial. It was a reign of fear mirrored on both sides of the divided nation. Yet even in this darkness, resistance grew stronger. In occupied Warsaw and Krakow, underground movements began forming almost immediately. The Polish underground state, one of the largest resistance organizations in history, emerged from the ashes of defeat. It operated schools, distributed newspapers, and coordinated sabotage missions against both German and Soviet occupiers. Communication lines were built in secret, connecting resistance cells across Europe. The spirit of the Polish people refused to be broken. Many who escaped Poland joined the fight abroad. Pilots who fled through Romania and France eventually reached Britain, where they formed the famous No. 303 Polish Fighter Squadron, a unit that would go on to play a heroic role in the Battle of Britain. These men, who had seen their homeland destroyed, fought with unmatched determination, their planes marked with the white and red checkerboard of Poland. While Europe watched in uneasy silence, Germany and the Soviet Union solidified their new borders. The world map was redrawn with ruthless precision. Hitler and Stalin, despite their ideological hatred, temporarily became partners in conquest. Their pact allowed them to carve up Eastern Europe like predators dividing prey. Yet beneath the surface, both sides were preparing for an inevitable confrontation. For now, their cooperation served a purpose: to expand their power and crush smaller nations caught in between. As 1940 approached, the consequences of the Polish campaign became clear. The lessons learned from the invasion shaped Germany's future military strategy. Blitzkrieg had proven devastatingly effective. It relied on speed, coordination, and surprise, striking before the enemy could even react. Hitler's generals refined this doctrine, preparing to unleash it again, this time against the West. Meanwhile, the Allies, Britain and France, remained passive. Despite their declaration of war, no major military action was taken. Soldiers sat in trenches along the Maginot Line, waiting for a German attack that would not come for months. Newspapers called it the Sitzkrieg, or phony war, as Europe seemed to hold its breath. In Poland, the silence of the Allies felt like betrayal. They had been promised help, but no armies marched to their rescue. For the Polish people, the realization was devastating. They had been sacrificed to buy time for others, but time was running out for everyone. The invasion of Poland had opened Pandora's box. Across Europe, dictators and generals studied Germany's tactics. Mussolini's Italy began plotting its own expansions. In Japan, military leaders saw the success of blitzkrieg as validation of their ambitions in Asia. The world was on the edge of chaos. In the months that followed, Germany moved swiftly to secure its position. Propaganda films showed Hitler visiting the front lines, congratulating soldiers and promising that peace was near. But within his inner circle, plans were already being made for the next phase of war. Hitler's ambitions stretched far beyond Poland. He wanted dominance over all of Europe. The fall of Poland had proven his army's strength, but it also revealed something deeper, the willingness of the world to hesitate. That hesitation would soon prove fatal. For the people of Poland, life under occupation grew harsher by the day. Families were torn apart, homes confiscated, and culture suppressed. Speaking Polish in public could result in punishment or death. Churches were closed or turned into warehouses, yet the underground press continued to publish, defying censorship and spreading hope. Secret schools kept Polish history alive, teaching children in basements and attics. Even as the occupiers tried to erase their identity, the Polish people clung to it with fierce pride. The winter of 1939-1940 was one of fear and endurance. Across the country, the snow-covered ruins of bombed cities, and hunger became a constant enemy. But in hidden forests, resistance fighters trained, armed with smuggled weapons and the determination to fight back. The Germans called them bandits. The Poles called them heroes. They carried out daring missions, blowing up trains, sabotaging factories, and gathering intelligence for the Allies. The price was high. For every act of resistance, the occupiers responded with brutal reprisals. Entire villages were burned and hostages executed. But still, the movement grew. In London, the Polish government in exile worked tirelessly to keep the cause of Poland alive. They maintained contact with the underground, coordinated military efforts, and pleaded with the Allies not to forget them. As Germany prepared for its next offensive, the lessons of Poland echoed across Europe. The world had seen how fast nations could fall when unprepared. France and Britain began rearming, but many wondered if it was already too late. Hitler had no intention of stopping. In his speeches, he spoke of destiny, of Germany's mission to dominate Europe. The invasion of Poland had given him the confidence he needed to press forward. Behind the scenes, he was already planning the invasion of Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and France. The road to total war had been paved with the ashes of Poland. By early 1940, the occupation had become a cruel routine. German officers enforced racial hierarchies, treating Poles as second-class citizens. Jews faced even worse persecution, forced into ghettos where starvation and disease spread rapidly. In Warsaw, the Jewish population was crammed into a small section of the city, surrounded by walls and barbed wire. Conditions were unbearable, but the people resisted with dignity, documenting their suffering so the world would one day know the truth. The brutality of occupation revealed the full face of Nazi ideology. Poland became a testing ground for the racial policies that would later lead to the Holocaust. Yet, even as despair deepened, hope refused to die. In whispers and in secret letters, people promised that Poland would rise again. They did not yet know how long the night would last, but they believed the dawn would come. By the spring of 1940, the echoes of Poland's destruction still haunted Europe. But the world was already moving toward even greater chaos. Hitler's armies stood ready, fueled by their lightning victory in the east. The invasion of Poland had been the first spark of the inferno, and now the flames were spreading westward. Yet for those trapped under German and Soviet occupation, the nightmare continued without pause. Entire communities lived under constant fear, where even a whisper of resistance could mean death. German authorities continued their brutal campaign to reshape Polish society. Thousands of intellectuals, priests, and officers were executed in what came to be known as the AB Action, a systematic effort to eliminate the nation's leadership class. The goal was clear: to destroy the heart of Poland's identity and ensure it could never rise again. In the countryside, German settlers began moving into confiscated Polish homes, while Polish families were expelled or forced into slave labor. Nazi ideology viewed Poles as inferior, useful only for menial work in support of the German war machine. the occupiers took food, livestock, and resources, leaving the local population to starve. Across the Eastern territories, the Soviet Union implemented its own form of repression. Thousands of Poles were rounded up and deported to remote regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Families were torn apart in the middle of the night, given only minutes to pack before being forced onto cattle trains. Many never returned. Among the most tragic moments came in the spring of 1940, when Soviet secret police massacred more than 20,000 Polish officers, police, and intellectuals in the forests of Kalinin. The Katyn massacre, denied for decades by the Soviet regime, was one of the most horrific crimes of the early war, an attempt to decapitate the Polish nation by murdering its best and brightest. Meanwhile, inside occupied Poland, the underground resistance was growing into a force of its own. The Polish underground state coordinated with the government in exile in London, managing intelligence operations and sabotage missions that directly aided the Allies. Polish agents provided crucial information about German troop movements, supply lines, and even details of secret weapons projects. One of their most remarkable achievements was the early intelligence gathered on the German Enigma code, which Polish cryptologists had been working on even before the war. Their findings would later prove essential to the Allied effort to break Nazi communications. Despite the growing strength of the resistance, the cost was staggering. German reprisals were merciless. For every act of sabotage, dozens of civilians were executed. Entire villages were destroyed as examples to others. Still, the underground continued to operate, knowing that every small act of defiance was part of a larger struggle for survival. The bravery of ordinary citizens became legendary. Couriers who carried messages under false identities, teachers who ran secret schools, and priests who hid the hunted. They were the heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. By 1941, the uneasy alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union began to crumble. Hitler's ambitions could no longer be contained by treaties. On June 22, 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, turning his armies eastward against the Soviet Union. For Poland, this new phase of the war brought both danger and opportunity. As German and Soviet forces clashed, the occupied Polish territories became a new front line. Villages that had suffered under Soviet rule now found themselves under German control once again. But liberation was not the right word. The Nazis intensified their terror, now targeting Jews, Poles, and anyone deemed undesirable with even greater ferocity. The ghettos expanded, forced labor camps multiplied, and the machinery of genocide began to take shape. In Warsaw, Krakow, and Lublin, entire communities were walled off, their inhabitants starved and brutalized. Yet even here, resistance took root. Secret networks smuggled food, medicine, and weapons into the ghettos. Leaders like Mordecai Anilovich began organizing underground movements that would later lead to uprisings against impossible odds. The Polish resistance, now reorganized as the Home Army, the Army of Krakow, became one of the most effective partisan forces in occupied Europe, operating in forests, mountains, and cities. They carried out sabotage missions against German railways, factories, and convoys. They also played a key role in rescuing Allied airmen and transmitting intelligence about Nazi operations, including early reports about the extermination camps that would shock the world. The reality of occupation was a constant test of humanity. Families faced impossible choices every day: to hide a neighbor and risk execution, or to remain silent and survive another day. Yet countless Poles chose courage. Many paid with their lives. The years dragged on, each one darker than the last. But even as war consumed the continent, the idea of a free Poland never faded. In London, the Polish government in exile continued to push for Allied support. Polish soldiers, sailors, and pilots fought valiantly across Europe, from the Battle of Britain to Monte Cassino and beyond. Their courage became a symbol of resistance, reminding the world that Poland's fight was not over. By 1943, the tide of war began to shift. The Allies were gaining ground, and Germany's invincibility was crumbling. In the east, the Red Army pushed the Germans back across the steppes of Russia. But for Poland, this new turn carried a bitter irony. As Soviet forces advanced, liberation meant exchanging one occupier for another. The Polish underground prepared for this moment carefully, knowing that the future of their nation might depend on who reached Warsaw first, the Soviets or the Western Allies. The Home Army launched Operation Tempest, a nationwide uprising designed to liberate Polish cities before the Soviets could impose their control. It was a desperate gamble, but it embodied the spirit of a people who had endured too much to simply surrender their fate again. The invasion of Poland in 1939 had begun as a tragedy, but by 1944, it had become a symbol of endurance, defiance, and the unbreakable will of a nation that refused to vanish. The scars of that first onslaught would never fade, but they had forged something unshakable in the Polish spirit. As the war neared its end, Poland stood once more at the crossroads of history, surrounded by powers greater than itself, but sustained by a courage the world could never forget. The story that began with bombs falling over Warsaw in 1939 had not ended. It had only transformed from the ashes of defeat to the fire of resistance, from occupation to rebellion, and from silence to a voice that would echo through generations. The invasion of Poland was more than the start of World War II. It was the test of a nation's soul, a lesson in what it means to fight even when hope seems lost, and a reminder that freedom, once taken, must always be fought for again. As the final battles of World War II raged across Europe, Poland once again became the stage for the clash of empires. The cities that had been reduced to rubble in 1939 were now shattered beyond recognition. The people who had endured 6 years of occupation, terror, and resistance had paid an unimaginable price. But as the Red Army advanced westward and the German war machine crumbled, the dream of liberation seemed near. In 1944, the Polish resistance launched its most daring act, the Warsaw Uprising. Tens of thousands of fighters rose against the German occupiers, determined to free their capital before the Soviets arrived. For 63 days, they fought street by street, house by house, armed with little more than stolen rifles, Molotov cocktails, and the will to reclaim their home. The uprising became a symbol of courage unmatched in modern history, but it also revealed the cruel indifference of politics. As Warsaw burned, Soviet forces halted their advance just across the Vistula River. The Red Army watched as the Germans systematically destroyed the city and massacred its defenders. The Polish resistance had been abandoned, not only by the enemy but by supposed allies. When the uprising finally fell in October, more than 200,000 people were dead, and Warsaw was a lifeless ruin. Hitler ordered the city to be erased from existence, its survivors sent to camps or executed on the spot. Yet even in total destruction, the Polish spirit endured. The ruins of Warsaw became a monument to resistance, a silent testament to a nation that refused to bow. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe celebrated victory over Nazi Germany. But for Poland, the end of one nightmare marked the beginning of another. The Yalta Conference, where the Allied leaders carved out the post-war world, decided Poland's fate without its consent. The Soviet Union claimed control over the country, establishing a communist government loyal to Moscow. The promise of freedom, for which millions had suffered and died, was once again stolen. The same land that had ignited the war now found itself trapped behind the Iron Curtain. The years that followed were marked by repression, censorship, and fear. The heroes of the resistance were often silenced, imprisoned, or executed by the new regime. The West, exhausted by war and eager to maintain peace, turned its attention elsewhere. Poland's sacrifice faded from headlines, but it remained etched in the memory of its people. Families rebuilt their lives from ashes, holding on to the fragments of a history that others had tried to erase. The story of Poland in World War II is not one of simple defeat or victory. It is the story of survival against impossible odds. It is the story of a nation that was invaded, divided, and occupied by two of history's most brutal regimes, yet still refused to surrender its identity. From the first shots fired at Westerplatte to the final ruins of Warsaw, Poland stood as both victim and symbol, a reminder of what happens when tyranny is allowed to rise unchecked. The invasion of Poland in 1939 reshaped the world. It exposed the fragility of peace and the consequences of hesitation. It showed that evil does not wait, and freedom cannot survive on promises alone. The lessons learned in those dark months became warnings for generations to come. The Polish people endured suffering beyond measure, but they also embodied the unbreakable spirit of resistance that would inspire others across the world. In the decades that followed, Poland remained under Soviet influence, but the flame of freedom never went out. It burned quietly in hearts, whispered in songs, and taught in secret classrooms. When the time came, that flame would reignite, first in protests, then in strikes, and finally in the rise of a movement that would bring the world to its knees. In 1980, for decades after the invasion, the Solidarity movement emerged from the shipyards of Jadovsk, led by ordinary workers who demanded the rights their parents had died for. Their courage rekindled the spirit of resistance, born in 1939. Within a decade, the Soviet Empire itself began to crumble, and Poland finally reclaimed the freedom it had fought for generations earlier. The invasion of Poland was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one that would span the entire 20th century, a story of oppression, endurance, and ultimate triumph. Today, when we look back on those September days of 1939, we see more than a military campaign. We see the moment the world changed forever. We see the consequences of silence, the price of freedom, and the strength of a people who refused to vanish. The streets of Warsaw, rebuilt from ashes, now stand as a living memorial to those who fell. The fields of Westerplatte, the forests of Katyn, and the ruins of old cities whisper the same message: never forget. The invasion of Poland was the spark that ignited the greatest war in human history. But it also gave birth to one of humanity's most enduring lessons, that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can outlast empires, and the will to be free can never truly be destroyed. History remembers nations not only for their victories, but for their endurance, their courage, and their refusal to surrender. And in that measure, Poland stands eternal.